It's a penalty to Manchester City. Gundogan against Hugo Lloris. Saved! Cut out by Harry Winks here, who's knocked over by Zinchenko, who's already got a yellow card, and Alexander Zinchenko's going to be sent off here. Clever little ball to Bergwijn. Oh yes! Oh, I say! If you're going to score on your debut, you might as well make it a good one. Steven Bergwijn has put Tottenham in front. And Dombele, he's got it through to Son. Flag stays down. 2-0. And Spurs have got the points. Back in the race for fourth place. Manchester City are 22 points off the lead of the Premier League.
On Sunday, Tottenham managed to pull off an unlikely victory over Manchester City, putting them in prime position to break into the top four of the Premier League. But although they won, the chasm between the two teams was notable. It is now 3 months since Jose Mourinho came into the club. But do Spurs really look like a team who are taking the next step? In this episode, we cast an eye over goings-on at New White Hart Lane and ask, are Spurs stuck in the past?
I was genuinely really upset because I have a lot of affection for Pochettino and what he's done for the club.
Nathan Clark is an analyst working in media and football.
Mourinho is someone who, especially personally, but like on a more objective level too, I have a disliking of, both in terms of like his personality, his character, but also his like tactical ideals and his football.
It sounds as though you're saying that the decision to hire Mourinho represents a change of direction for Spurs, at least for a fan watching the team perform on the field. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess so. But like under Levy, we've done this thing where we've gone old school manager Harry Redknapp.
No, we don't do that. No, fuck off.
Progressive manager Andre Villas-Boas.
The theory was football oriented.
Old school manager Tim Sherwood.
And so we've took a couple of knocks in the privates, and we've come back.
Progressive manager Pochettino.
And this is our philosophy.
So it's kind of continuing that pattern, which is very chaotic. I don't know, it was still strange. You would still have thought that with the success we'd had under Pochettino that we would continue in the direction of those ideals.
Pochettino sacked as coach of Tottenham Hotspur. Surprised?
I'm surprised if it's a sacking. If Daniel Levy has just dragged him upstairs and said, listen, here's your books, thanks very much for your 5 years, see you later, then I'm surprised, because that's harsh for what he's done.
What would you say went wrong with Pochettino?
I think there's a lot of factors, and throughout all of them, time is the most important one, right? Relationships break down over time, ideas become tired over time, and the squad's really deteriorated over time. I do think that despite all those things that, where the blame lies all over the place, where relationships did fry, I think that if there had been greater turnover in the squads, those issues may have at very least taken longer to materialise.
Would you say that that was the cause of the problems that happened on the pitch? Is there, again, a sense of which time is an important factor there? That's something that we heard a lot as the sort of end game played out, is that the Spurs players were fed up of playing the way that Pochettino wanted them to play.
Yeah, and it's really hard to separate how much of the breakdown in performances was based on issues within the squad and how much of it is just the players giving up. Now, obviously, we have a very similar squad now under Mourinho, and performances are better, so it's not like it was a non-factor, this sort of impression that things have become stale. But it's hard to separate them.
You've already sort of mentioned the fact that you share an affinity with the Pochettino aesthetic when it comes to tactics, and less so with Mourinho. How do you describe that Pochettino aesthetic to a casual fan? What was Pochettino trying to do on the field?
He was trying to control the game, both with actions in and out of possession. So he wanted to play a possession brand of football, and he wanted to press the ball immediately after losing it so as to minimise the threat offered by the opposition and the amount of time that they would have the ball for, so that Spurs could return to having possession themselves. And these in combination allow Spurs attacking players to take risks and be creative, safe in the knowledge that if they fail with their attacking pass, that Spurs can win the ball back and go again.
And how would you contrast that with what Mourinho's been doing since he's arrived at the club?
Well, what Mourinho's been doing since he's arrived at the club is sort of not a million miles away from that. And he said to himself that he didn't want to change too much. Now, we have seen sort of more, I would say, reactive tendencies and more reactive games. If you look at the Liverpool game and how defensively we set up in that one, and our growing tendency to sort of sit on leads and our growing tendency to play direct out of the back line. But we're still seeing Spurs press quite high, and we're still seeing sort of interesting combinations and positional stuff that sort of, a hangover isn't the right word, a continuation of what we saw under Pochettino.
And how do you think that's going to continue going forward? Is it simply the case that Mourinho is going to take those players and say, the best thing I can do with these players is play the way that Pochettino is playing with them? But as the squad slowly regenerates, will that mean he'll introduce more and more of his own ideas into that? Or do you think he's fairly set now on sort of being Pochettino light?
I don't think it's so much that he'll introduce his own ideas, it's that the previous ideas will begin to dissipate, that they'll be forgotten. And then all that will be left is what Mourinho is doing now. So the question is, how capable is Mourinho of primarily teaching a style of play that he's never really coached before?
Last week you tweeted, and I quote here, "Over the last few weeks under Mourinho, we have recovered from catastrophe to become a football team again. It's just that team isn't a very good one." Obviously, this is a tongue-in-cheek tweet, but I think it does contain a nugget of truth. And I was wondering if you could unpack that nugget of truth for us.
Yeah, so we were completely falling apart in games under Pochettino, despite the intentions that were there and our absolutely terrible results and performances. With a fresh manager coming in and motivating players and resolving personal issues and giving some semblance of new ideas and new training sessions, we've passed through this phase where everything is terrible. You're no longer sort of overcome with the sense that collapse is imminent at any time. We've returned to being sort of what appears to be a football team, but that team has dramatic shortcomings both in personnel and I think growingly in ideas.
So I'm interested to hear what you think that the trajectory is going to be for Spurs for the rest of the season. How do you think that the rest of the season will pan out?
So we are recording this on the afternoon of deadline day, and it looks like we're not going to sign the striker. The club have shown no interest in signing a defensive midfielder, which I find bizarre. So I see the season probably continuing largely as it is over the last few games. So not terrible, but just sort of petering along, wins here and there, a Europa League finish.
And what about in the long term? How do you see the long term unfolding under Mourinho?
The long term is the bigger fear, because I accept that there's already been short-term improvement and there may well be good short-term returns under a manager who focuses on domestic cups and such. But I don't think that's so great that it justifies the risks that you take long-term with Mourinho. Essentially, if you look at every club that he's managed throughout his career, things have gone really sour before and then continued to be really sour after he's left. Now, Pochettino wasn't immune from that himself. You know, managers have sell-by dates at clubs. I accept that, but I do think that Mourinho tends to leave under particularly toxic terms.
So it sounds to me, from what I'm hearing, that you think that the appointment of Mourinho is in general a bad thing for the club.
I accept that a change was probably necessary at that point, and I will acknowledge that Mourinho has made a lot of simplistic improvements, such as, you know, his particular use of Sergio Aurier and use of a defensive left back, that sort of stuff. But also, like, he appears to be attempting to modernise his game. He's using positional ideas and he's pressing higher. It's possible that Mourinho can evolve as a manager. but I maintain that there were better options out there.
But in the modern era, football is not simply played on the field. The question as to Jose Mourinho's impact at Spurs cannot be fully answered without casting an eye over the off-field activities of the club.
As ever with anything to do with Daniel Levy, it's a two-sided argument.
Seb Stafford-Bloor is a journalist whose work can primarily be found at Tifo Football, 442 and Football365.
Whether some of the positives create a kind of a more flattering context for some of the more negative situations, that's a point of contention. But I'd say that at Tottenham, as always, it's a compromise between what needs to be done and what people would like to see done. And I think we're seeing that playing out through the transfer market gossip columns at the moment.
So give us a flavour of some of the off-field issues at Spurs right now.
I think the central one, and I think one which has existed ever since Jose Mourinho arrived, is that there is an obvious clash in ideologies between what Tottenham under Daniel Levy and Inik have traditionally been and what Jose Mourinho stands for. So obviously his synonyms are nearly all related to budget and off-the-peg players and success at any kind of cost, whereas Tottenham have at least attempted in the past to be a sort of a more organic club, so they've been more focused on trying to do things at low cost with a view on a more gentle type of progress. And I think whatever people believe Jose Mourinho's tenure will ultimately be at Spurs, there's going to be a scenario at some point in the future where that clash reveals itself and manifests in something quite destructive. A lot of it's based on sort of patterns of behaviour and prejudging Mourinho, but then I would argue that it's very difficult not to do that. And the same is really true of Levy, because obviously his behavioural patterns have been established over many, many years now. He's coming up to 20 years as chairman at the club. And some of the habits that he had when Spurs were really just a mid-table club, he still has now when they're inside the Champions League, when they're inside their new stadium, and when they have the means to be a little bit more ambitious.
Now, I'm very proud to be chairman of this great club, but I'm just a custodian. I mean, when I'm gone, there'll be somebody else, and then there'll be somebody else.
Obviously, Daniel Levy is central to everything that is going on off the field. And as you've already mentioned, he's a complex figure. He's done a lot of good for the club, but there are fans who question the extent to which he is still useful. What's your take on Levy?
I think I'm confused by just how binary that discussion often is. I think it's very clear that when you're discussing Daniel Levy, it's a conversation which has to be compartmentalised. You can view Levy as almost the financial prospector, the person who is the guardian of the club's long-term interests. And the perception you get from that is very different to what you think of Daniel Levy as a purely in terms of what he's been able to create from a football's perspective. So in terms of, is he someone that is going to leverage the club's future against potentially having 2 or 3 years in the sun? Absolutely not. At the same time, it feels as if because he refuses to conform to that ideal, everything else, for some fans at least, everything else becomes incidental. And you're right to say it's complex. You cannot ignore just how difficult the situation is that he's navigated in completing the new stadium project. I think we only need to look a few miles down the road to see what might have happened with West Ham. I'm not sure how determined Spurs ever were to take possession of the Olympic Stadium and knock it down completely and rebuild it from scratch, which seemingly wasn't the most attractive offer. But it would have been the easiest solution, and what has been created is extremely impressive. So it's very hard to disentangle one from the other.
I think fundamental to the question of where you fall on Levy is the question of how you fall on the issue of the current business model at Spurs. How would you describe that business model?
I'd say it's hesitant, it's reserved. The complication is obviously the stadium went well over budget. According to the most recent figures, it cost nearly £1 billion to construct all in, and the club had to borrow to complete it. At the moment, we're lacking a little bit of clarity about just how much those debt repayments impinge on the club's working budget. It's very difficult to know that, and I've heard different people make equally compelling arguments for and against that. So I'm not really entirely sure what to believe. I think what's still clear is that although the initial wage budget and the wage ceiling, which used to be £100,000 a week, that's been relaxed now. We're seeing players gradually creep up the wage scale. but not to a point where Spurs have any sort of parity with the teams they're competing against. The highest earner remains Harry Kane, rightfully so, but that's still a situation where an awful lot of his contract is bonus related. And that's obviously part of a separate conversation about why he has a ruptured hamstring at the moment. But Tottenham still work in what they believe is a sort of cost-effective way. So you're seeing that at the moment in the current transfer window. So the first team has some very obvious needs. It needs a forward. It needs a backup to Harry Kane. It probably needs a couple of fullbacks. But it is still dependent on selling players, which further complicates that idea about just what kind of effect those debt repayments are having. So why is it that instead of selling Christian Eriksen in the summer, they waited until January to sell him for far less than they might have done, and then start to replace him after that had happened? It doesn't imply that that just because they've entered a new stadium, they've begun a new era of free spending.
Earlier in the month, you wrote a piece for 442 which was titled The Conflict of Daniel Levy, Why Tottenham Need a Sporting Director. Can you tell us a little bit about what your argument in that piece was?
So it stems from a belief that I have that Daniel Levy is too involved in club business. He is Tottenham. And I believe that works into this great mistake a lot of football clubs have made for decades, actually, that they conflate being a very smart businessman, having a lot of kind of commercial acumen, with being able to make sporting decisions. That mistake has been made time and again. It's currently being made at Manchester United, for instance, one of the very unfortunate situation with Ed Woodward and the attacks on his house, but it stems from this idea that sport is not easy. It's not something you can just play at. You cannot have hobbyist sporting directors just making transfer decisions based on nothing, no experience, no qualifications. And I think one of the problems with Daniel Levy is that he fits into that mold. Like, he's a very, very astute businessman for the reasons that we've discussed. I mean, it's quite a balance that he found in navigating the club away from White Hart Lane. What he is not, however, is someone that is in a position to make judgment calls on what a footballer is worth to a team. For instance, one of the problems towards the end of Maurizio Pochettino's reign was that supposedly, according to bits of information which leaked out of the dressing room, training routines have become very stale, and players who felt that they should be awarded new contracts weren't. They were actually actively being tried to get rid of by the club. In that situation, who is going to tell someone like Maurizio Pochettino that he is wrong on his stance towards, for instance, Toby Alderweireld? Is Daniel Levy qualified to make that judgment? Does he have the footballing credibility to kick through Pochettino's door and say, hang on a minute, here's another perspective? No, because someone like Pochettino would turn around in response and say, hang on, go and do your commercial deals, go and sign a donut partnership, because that's what you're good at, that's what you're qualified to do. So the idea behind the piece was really to say, look, you need a figure with the right gravitas in a football club all the time to not only just transcend managerial eras, but to be of benefit to a Pochettino-style head coach, to be a peer, really.
The question that I would ask is, when you're facing a situation that is perceived of as being negative, the grass is always greener on the other side. So do you think if Spurs were to implement a sporting director, is there negatives that would emerge? Is Levy using those negatives as an excuse for not having a sporting director, for example?
Yeah, well, I think he's using his prior experience. I think what's happened is during Levy's lifespan as a chairman, he's employed, I think, 4 different sporting directors/directors of football. Frank Arneson was there. Damien Comolli, Angel of Death himself, was there for a little bit. Paul Mitchell and Franco Baldini. Now, each of those people did different roles and their jobs were described in different ways, but they each ended on bad terms. Daniel Levy's habit in those situations has been whenever one of those reigns has turned bad, he's kind of made a 180-degree turn away from it, ideologically. So obviously, I suppose the example that's most famous is the night when Juande Ramos was sacked, followed by Damien Comolli, followed by Gus Poyet. He got rid of the entire footballing structure in the space of about 12 hours and appointed Harry Redknapp. It's kind of, I mean, that's your sort of typical moment. And I completely understand why not repeating that mistake is so appealing to Daniel Levy. But then my counterpoint would be that just because you've employed the wrong person doesn't mean that the job you're employing them for. There are negatives because you're essentially adding another technical layer into a club which produces another voice. It introduces another authority into decisions. But that's a balance that a lot of clubs seem able to get right. If you look around the Premier League at the moment, who is the best performing Premier League club in the country? It'd be Liverpool, and Liverpool have used that structure. Obviously, the headline for Liverpool's recent renaissance is Jurgen Klopp's work, But you really can't look beyond the work done by Michael Edwards, not just in terms of talent procurement, but also the way that underwhelming squad players have been jettisoned and what the club have been able to do as a result of that process. And so it's become a lot more complicated than just the chairman or the manager trying to do a deal. There's a very outdated model, and it feels, for whatever reason, as if Spurs remain wedded to it.
It almost feels as though Levy is building a club in the ideal image that he had of what a club was 20 years ago. In that sense, he sees himself as doing the right thing, but maybe the modern context of the game will have a different idea.
Well, I think so. And also, if you wanted to extend that a little bit further, but you could almost apply that to Mourinho too, because my own personal feeling is that Jose Mourinho is at Tottenham now because Daniel Levy couldn't get him at Tottenham 10 years ago. It feels very vanity-like. So we talked earlier about the kind of the ideological chasm between those two men and the organisation that Mourinho is now working for. But equally, it feels as if Jose Mourinho himself belongs to a slightly different time. So in terms of the imperative of moving to a new stadium, okay, that belongs to maybe 2010. But then employing Mourinho as your kind of ultimate winner, well, that's very 2010 too, isn't it? So you could tie those two things together quite easily.
So if we try and hold apart the on-field and the off-field and pit them against each other at Spurs at the moment, which do you think is the more problematic for the club right now?
I think on the field, because I think the pitch leads everything. Very famously, about a year ago, Ed Woodward made a comment about how at Manchester United, performance does not really instruct commercial prosperity. Increasingly, that's been proven not to be the case, because instead of offering these big 5-10-year deals, entities who want to sponsor football clubs, they're looking at what a football club is doing on the pitch. So they want to know, are you going to be in the Champions League? What is your brand, and I use that in inverted commas, going to represent? Are you a successful aspirant club, or are you just an old name? And I think, obviously, Tottenham's world is very different to Manchester United's. It isn't backed by the same kind of history, but I think that's also true. I think that if you want to achieve in the commercial sense, if you want to separate yourself from the rest of the Premier League pack, you have to stand for something as a football team, not just as a club, not just as a kind of, you can't, if you're Tottenham, continue to talk about Bill Nicholson forever. It doesn't really work like that, as much as we all want it to, and as much as we appreciate that kind of symbolism as fans. I think you actually have to aspire towards something. So I think increasingly it is about what you stand for, about where you are likely to go as a football team.
Nathan Clark is an analyst working in media and football. Seb Stafford-Bloor is a journalist whose work can primarily be found at Tifo Football, 442 and Football365. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you like this podcast, why not rate and review on iTunes or share an episode with a friend? See you next time.